We want to talk more about all of this, the news both foreign and domestic, joined by our panel this morning. CBS State Department correspondent Margaret Brennan is back, along with David Rohde of Reuters and USA Today Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page. I would also say that we had hoped to have Washington Post reporter Nia Malika Henderson with us this morning, but just a few minutes ago her office called and told her to come back to the newspaper to supervise their earthquake coverage. So I guess we're all in the news business. We all understand this. Susan, how far has Ferguson set back race relations in this country, or has it?
You know, I think what it's done, it's reminded Americans about some of the racial problems that persist. And boy, it spotlights once again the chasm between the way whites and blacks tend to see issues like this. Only about a third of whites thought the police went too far. 2/3 of blacks thought the police went too far in Ferguson. So maybe we think we have an African American president, we have an African American attorney general. A lot of us think we've made real progress in race relations. This is a reminder of how far we still have to go.
Well, it brings back to those of us of a certain age, that would be me, of course, what we saw at the O.J. trial, the O.J. Simpson trial, where the perception just split right down the middle, how it was viewed by one community and how it was viewed by another. Well, let's talk about this situation in ISIS that's going ISIS and all of that. Margaret, you were talking about there is planning, at least underway, at the Pentagon about striking back, maybe even into Syria. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to get the Congress to agree on any kind of plan at this point. When you stop and think about it, when did the president send up this $500,000 request? Not $500,000, $500 million, wasn't it? $500 million.
$500 million train and equip program for the Syrian rebels. That was just a few months ago.
But yet it just sat there. Nobody
right.
seemed to think that, well, we'll get around to it when we get around to it.
Right, and that wouldn't be funded until 2015, so there's not necessarily a quick reaction to the ISIS threat on that level. At least there is a smaller covert program to train some rebels, but building up an army to fight ISIS doesn't happen overnight. Certainly, some programs could be launched, but one of the other challenges here beyond Congress is getting an Arab country in the region to agree to host such a train and equip program, because so many fear then becoming a target if they take in these fighters to make them actually be a standing quick reaction.
Has anybody said, oh, let us do that?
The Jordanians are very reluctant. There is some training that they do and allow for the U.S. to conduct for special forces, for Iraqis and others, but there's real reluctance to advertise that, because then it's seen as you're in the game. But bigger picture, a strategy needs to be articulated before the president goes to Congress or speaks to the public here. And it's not clear that there is one that the president is comfortable taking, or at least not a position yet publicly that would marry him to military action.
David, I want to talk to you a little about something that you are uniquely qualified to discuss, and that is this idea of these captives, these enormous ransoms that these people are asking. You know a little something about that because you were taken captive by the Taliban and held for how long? What, 7 months?
7 months, yeah.
7 months in Afghanistan, later moved over to Pakistan. Is it time for the United States to review this strategy that we have of we flatly say we don't pay ransom to terrorists? And I think the reasons for that are understandable, but other countries are, and that's what's complicating this.
Yeah, I definitely think it's the time for the international community to talk about this lack of a strategy. I agree with the American approach, which is, to be fair to these other countries, the U.S. government doesn't pay ransoms, but if a family or an organization can pay a ransom, the U.S. will turn a blind eye to that. The problem is that European countries, France, we saw this in the Foley case, he was held with French hostages, Spanish hostages, a Danish hostage. They were all ransomed. Jim Foley's dead. And when these governments pay very large ransom, millions of dollars, no family can compete with that. The Foley family couldn't compete with that, and it's not working. There's one estimate that Al-Qaeda affiliates have gotten $125 million in ransom, primarily from European governments, just in the last 5 years.
What do you think the impact of the Foley killing is going to be, Susan? My sense is it was, in a macabre kind of way, a wake-up call. Certainly we saw the statements coming out of the Pentagon this week. They took a much sharper edge, as it were. Is that reflecting what's going on at the Pentagon, or do you, at the White House, or do you think that the State Department and the Pentagon may be ahead of the White House on this?
You know, I think this could be a real turning point. You had Mike Morrell saying this is the most complex terrorism problem he's ever encountered. What kind of statement is that from someone who is a career CIA intelligence operative? That is a terrifying statement from your previous guest, and I think it is really, the horrific scene there, I think, has really touched a lot of Americans. Now the question is, what has been the impact on President Obama? Because we've seen in the past, President Obama has at times has talked pretty tough, but he's been kind of allergic to military action when it comes right down to it. Does this change his calculus on what to do? That, I think, is the question to watch.
Presidents go on vacation, and I can't recall a one who went on vacation then didn't get some criticism for doing it. LBJ would go to his ranch. First President Bush went to Kennebunkport. The other Bush went down to Crawford, Texas. But this president seems to be especially criticized for this vacation. What do you suppose that's about?
You know, I don't think anybody who's fair begrudges president's vacation. We know how exhausting that job is. I thought the White House could have shown a little more sensitivity after the statement that the president made following the execution of Jim Foley, to then immediately go to the golf course. You know, it's the, I guess the word we now use all the time is the optics. The optics of that were a little jarring, and I thought possibly it would have been wise of the president to do something else in the period right after making that statement.
Do you think it has anything to do, David and Margaret, with just the fact that America is coming out of two very long wars? The country is really sick of war. I don't think there's any question about that. It's almost, we're seeing a feeling almost as it was before World War II, when the nation was sick of war and you had a strong isolationist atmosphere in this country led by Lindbergh, who said we have to stay out of wars. In many ways, we're in kind of a situation like that right now, because this threat, and I agree with these assessments, this is a group of people unlike anything we've really dealt with, even on the terrorist front up until now.
Well, I think one of the problems with the statement, you know, the American public is war weary, they may very well be, but the national security community can never afford to be. And many policymakers, I mean, I remember sitting in briefings back in October of 2013 at the State Department where they were warning about the high number of suicide bombings that were spiking in Iraq, about the lack of a border between Iraq and Syria. And certainly the intelligence community has been warning about this for some time. So when the national security establishment has said they've been worried and there hasn't been a follow-through on strategy in a more robust way, I think there are legitimate questions to be asked there about why it would seem there is a degree of catch-up being played. I think I want to come back to one of the things that David was talking about with the prisoner question. There's a lot of frustration among some of these families of hostages that not enough was done. And I think this question of what happened with the decision to swap Sergeant Bo Bergdahl for some prisoners that were held at Guantanamo Bay has also brought to the forefront what precedent, if any, has been set there, and should, perhaps if not money, should there be prisoner swaps or things considered? I'm not saying it's legitimate, but I'm saying the question is now being raised.
Let's take a break here, and we'll come back and talk about this and some of the other news of the week when we come back. And back now to talk about the news of the week. David, we talk about the search for ISIS and trying to find these bases. There's another equally intense search going on, and Margaret touched on it, and that is the search for Arab allies to help us in this deal.
And I think that's a key issue, and we were just talking about this also. Can the president sort of move American public opinion to get Americans to support a limited effort, and can he also get an Arab state to back us? I think a lot of Americans are skeptical. They say we don't have allies in this region. There is some good news. The Kurds have been fighting well. They retook that dam near Mosul. I think there are allies, and I think we need to have a long-term strategy to arm and train local forces. Most people don't like the Islamic State. Most Muslims are horrified and disgusted by the killing of Jim Foley. The president, though, needs to lead on that. He gave a much stronger statement, and then he went golfing. But that was the first clear vision I've heard from him about the threat we face, and we must respond. And he needs to now describe a new strategy that's not boots on the ground, George Bush style, but not, just drones, Barack Obama first term style.
Well, you saw today ISIS is out there taking credit, and you've seen some Syrian activists also talking about the fact that they have taken an airbase in Syria that was controlled by the Syrian regime. Where you saw the Assad regime sort of be complicit in the rise of ISIS, according to some diplomats, now you are seeing outright fighting between the two. And there's this idea circulating out there, maybe the U.S. should partner with someone they call a war criminal, Bashar al-Assad, to take on ISIS. The reason that question is even being raised is because of what David's talking about, not really having a clear ally in the region in terms of Arab countries being willing to fight alongside the U.S. on this one. But it's also because while U.S. airstrikes are backed up by movements on the ground by Kurds and Iraqi army in Iraq, in Syria, there is no Syrian moderate opposition that's been trained to be an army. What backs up airstrikes? And it's still not clear what that strategy is going to be if you get a coalition to hit through some coordinated action.
Well, when was it? It was not so long ago that there was a debate within the administration on whether we should give some sort of support to those, to the good Syrian rebels that were fighting Assad. We famously know now that Secretary Clinton wanted to do that. The president vetoed it. And that, well, that was about a year ago, wasn't it?
Right. Well, it was almost exactly a year ago that the U.S. was having a conversation about strikes against the Syrian regime, and those were called off. And almost exactly a year later, we're talking about hitting what the U.S. sees as a new enemy, ISIS here. ISIS has been fighting the moderate rebels that we've been saying we've been supporting. They have been at war with each other. And so in the absence of alternatives, you're left with these two very dirty partners here, right? Do you go with ISIS? Do you go with the Assad regime? It's not clear what the U.S. can do if they can quickly train moderates to step up and fill that gap, or whether they even want to.